Yes. 7 fat years, 7 lean years. It's the bonus episode that took me a month and a half to write. I am so sorry.
Well, technically, Liam was supposed to write it.
Yeah, no, Liam was supposed to write it and handed it off because Liam had burnout.
We were both, but we had a difficult. You don't want to hear our excuses. You know who we are, but we have a guest, and we are here to talk about museums.
Yes,
guest, tell us about museums.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Monroe. I work at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. I also am very active in the museum labor movement to unionize museum workers. Museums are bad. They could be better, but they're generally pretty bad. And we're going to tell you why.
That's right. So first I thought we'd get into what is a museum, right?
It's a building
I don't have
pretty pictures
these
in it.
notes. Can someone send me these notes, please?
The link is, oh my God.
I'm using I had a separate.
Hold on,
1
Liam.
second, please.
Hold on. I'll put it in the Zencastr chat.
Liam, do you not know what a museum is?
Hey, Jeremy, I've met you in person. I will come down there and rearrange you. You will be looking like a Picasso painting by the end of it. I will singularly invent realistic cubism.
A museum is a place that contains stuff. Next slide, please.
Oh, see, my slides were kind of in here. I was looking at okay, yeah, right. Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right, so this is some stuff.
Yes.
Stuff was invented very early in human history. When people started like finding cool rocks or like making little lumps of clay into shapes. Because we're social animals. We like making stuff and having stuff made for us. And also we like showing the stuff that we have to other people as a flex.
Yes.
Now, obviously, in primitive societies, everything was fine because they lived in, communism, which was good, or anarchism, which was good. But
thank you, Alice.
At some point, we have to talk about the concept of possession. Like, this is my stuff, not your stuff. It is exclusive to me. And thankfully, English is very literal. A thing is your possession when you possess it, and you possess it by maintaining physical control over it.
Mm-hmm.
You possess enough of it, or it's nice enough, and it's treasure.
Much like a demon possesses.
Yes, absolutely.
And then in order to end that possession, you need to be exorcised, of course.
I thought it was really weird when Roz was possessed by a demon that the priest just kept telling him to bike further.
Yes.
Yeah, just walk it off. Walk it off. Now, at some point, you have enough stuff that you stop being able to physically have a hand on everything you own. And this leads to the creation of laws, which is widely regarded as one of humanity's worst mistakes.
Cosine.
Yes.
I mean, it led to me going to law school for several years, so I took that very personally.
I literally work in like property law and museums, basically, because I make sure we acquire the things. So I can confirm property law not great.
Different kinds of imaginary ways of possessing things in order to get people in trouble at some remove. But even with the protection of law, without like a central legal system, you want to keep your possessions, your treasures secured, right? You can do this in any number of ways, right? You can put them in a big box and lock it. You can put it underground in a hole. You can put them in a big defensible building. But the better you secure these things, the harder it is to take them out and show them to people to be like, look at my cool thing. Either like just to do that or for some like more involved religious or civic function. And so there is immediately a tension there, right? Which we will come back to. Next slide, please.
An early XKCD.
That's right. written by a young scientist called Onfim in Novgorod. At some point, we invent writing. Writing, also a huge mistake because it leads to posting. But writing allows you to make knowledge and stories and narratives into movable, transferable, securable goods. It also gives you some kudos, some cool points, right? Like you have a lot of scrolls or a lot of books, and that means you're a smart person, and people still believe this. But also, you need somewhere to put them, right?
Sure.
Now, this develops into different forms. In the classical Greek perception, each of the 9 forms of art, epic poetry, sacred poetry, lyric poetry, history, comedy, tragedy, astronomy, music, and dance, is personified by a goddess, a muse, who inspires, literally, breathes into you the thing. Ask me for the names of the muses, because I know that shit for some fucking reason.
What
Alice!
are the names of the muses, Alice?
Oh god, Euterpe, Calliope, Clio, Thalia, Melpomene, Terpsichore, Eraso, Polyhymnia, and Urania.
Wait, does the muse in museum have anything to do with the muses?
We'll get to that in the next slide.
Jeremy, god damn it, stop looking ahead.
Now I'm learning.
So if you have a place for muses, that's a museon, or a museum if you want to speak Latin.
A mouseon, I'm
Or
seeing
a
here.
museum if you're from Baltimore and don't know how to fucking talk.
That's right.
The man who lives
Now-
in Philly said unironically.
The Baltimore accent and the Philly accent are like the same accent.
Yeah, now.
This is the first museum, which was just called the Museum, built by one of the Ptolemies in Alexandria in the 4th century BCE. A lot of things. Not actually a museum, not to us. It's more like a university. It's got like a lot of scholars there who are kept sort of provided for and, live in it and work together, and it has a library. But the relevant part of this is the name.
We see here a man looking angrily at a scroll.
Mhm.
We also
Aren't we
see,
all?
yes.
Yeah.
That's
me
the
on
as-built.
Twitter.com. Yeah.
I like that this print here is just like basically the equivalent of like B-roll of a documentary where like they had to get everybody in a room to like do things, and it's like, oh, hey, can you read a scroll like really seriously?
Can you frown at this scroll?
hey, guy, could you bend over with like a bunch of scrolls, but you would never actually carry them like that?
He's picking something up off the floor.
Yeah, it's like a university prospectus where it's like, go ahead and eat lunch in this one courtyard. No one actually eats lunch in, you know?
I'm in a university class, but we're being taught outside.
I love to lie on some grass.
I'm here at the university orientation for the museum. Yes. This tuition is gonna bankrupt me. They want like 3 talents for 3 years.
On the bright side, at least now, regardless of being bankrupt with university tuition, you don't have to do your finals on scrolls.
Yes, but they did make you work off your debt in the fields.
Dude, that's called co-op. Duh, you don't do that anymore.
So crucially, the museum is not a museum. What is a museum is the next slide. What we think of as functionally a museum, which is a place you put your stuff and you show it to people, right? For like civic purposes. If you use it for religious purposes, that's more of a temple kind of deal. But like, if you're just trying to like educate and edify and entertain people, that's more perhaps what we think of as a museum. And this is the first one that we know about. It's in Iraq, in what was the city of Ur.
How do you think it got that name?
Or
you think
have you heard of its sister city either?
Yeah. You think someone was like, well, what should we name the city? And the other guy was like,
I don't think I'm wrong. Yucatan apparently was, and forgive me for not knowing the indigenous people's names on the top of my head. I think was their phrase for "I can't understand you," and so the Spanish were like, Yucatan. I may be wrong. Please don't come for me in the comments. I just heard that.
If it is the like situation, like that's like the DC Metro, the station Metro Center is just called Metro Center because the first WMATA general was an actual general, and he was like, "You have 2 seconds to give a name to this station," and the guy went Metro Center, which is just in DC parlance, it just means you know, when we talk, we just go like, "Oh, I don't know what to say next." Metro Center.
Yes. Which is ironic because, of course, L'Enfant Plaza has more lines going through it.
So in
God damn you, Ross.
the metro center of Mesopotamia.
Boom.
In the 6th century BCE, there was a woman who lived there who was the king's daughter and who occupied a series of roles, including priestess, scribe, and teacher.
And train operator.
And train operator.
operator.
And in 550 BCE, she had constructed for her a terminus station to be filled with objects that she and her dad had dug up that were old, explicitly for the purpose of allowing people to, like, marvel at them.
So are they also the first archaeologists?
Yes, that we know of.
So I asked that because my dad was asking that question because he wanted to know we were recording tonight.
Yeah, no, the development of archaeology and the development of museums are very, very closely linked.
That makes sense.
And because if you write stuff on stone, it stays up for a long time. We have the inscriptions of these. Her dad, presumably supportive of all this, because one of the inscriptions says, "May Belshati Nana, the daughter, beloved of my heart, be strong before them, and may her word prevail," which is very nice.
That's sweet.
Yeah. So this is like surprisingly like what we think of as a museum. Like, it's objects dug out of the ground, put on display, curated with like labels explaining what they are. And since this was probably part of a temple complex and a school, it's got like a religious and an educational purpose. And what's interesting is this is like the first and last purpose-built museum that we know of for a while.
Do you think like people walked in, see all the ancient artifacts, and like,
that's just from Ted's house, man.
Yeah, it's like, it's 550 BC. This isn't so impressive. We're all archaeological remnants by now.
What the Sumerian for exit through gift shop is.
Boom. What if they had like the MoMA gift shop or OG was there though? You know, like what would they be selling?
Yeah, you can get like a little miniature, like
Etruscan boar vessel.
Yeah, a little tablet keychain. Still doesn't have your name on it.
Next slide, please.
Oh,
so
they definitely had like little keychains with your name on it.
Oh yeah,
chiseled in clay. You know,
my son is also named Bort Shalti Nana. So just blasting through history here to get through this first part. Like antiquity, right? People don't stop having cool stuff to show off, but there are sort of 3 diverging paths here. Path 1, you use it for more like explicitly religious purposes, like you put your cool stuff in temples. Path 2, you just keep it in your house, and like you might show it to visitors, but not to like the general public. And path 3, if you want to show off stuff to people in general, you just do that outside. And I'm going to be really, really annoying here and say that a Roman triumph is a museum.
Oh,
this is what we see here. This is like, I'm glad you said that, because this is my whole thing, is that actually a lot of things in the world that we don't think of as museums or museums. Or like art exhibitions, like for example, like video games or museums. Like how is playing a first person video game not walking through like a art exhibition? Anyways,
the opening to the videos they'd show you in school, where the opening was like, you know, the traveling through the weird museum thing.
Oh, the eyewitness videos.
The eyewitness videos. Yeah,
Dorling Kindersley, eyewitness. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say, if you don't think the intro to Quake 4 is art, we can't be friends.
So, like, in this case, a triumph is a pretty pure example of a museum. Like, you take a bunch of stuff that you have, like, you know, slaves or gold or a big menorah that you got somewhere. Let's not answer any questions about that.
Give it back.
And you parade it before the people so that the people know what they are and are impressed by them, right? And like the sort of educational aspect that we would think of for a modern museum is mostly just like guys, like philosophers or encyclopedists. Some rich guy, probably named Pliny, shows up, researches your deal, writes about what he thinks your deal is, and then some other guy receives that knowledge via scroll, right?
So
but he doesn't
just
usually
Wikipedia.
like collect stuff.
Only
Yeah,
travel
exactly.
blog.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just museums today, to be clear. Like, curators just like write exhibition catalogs and just tell people what the art is about, right? And not actually ask communities what their art is about.
This was revealed to me in a dream.
But crucially, your Pliny or whoever generally doesn't take the stuff itself. He just writes about it. Where you do have large collections of stuff, it's mostly art, it's mostly statuary, and that tends to be either religious or private. Next slide, please, as we absolutely blast through a very stupid and very Eurocentric version of history. So, by the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, you may have heard of these guys, has accumulated.
Hold on.
Has accumulated by default a huge amount of this Roman statuary, which they like, but it's all too pagan to like make much religious use of it. So you can't just put it in a church, generally speaking. And so, you know, at some point, somebody goes to the Pope. Pope Sixtus IV should not be legal to have Sixtuses who aren't number 6, I think.
Well, you had to get the number 6 somehow.
25 or 6 to Pope.
So
thank you, William.
they go to Sixtus IV and they're like, we got to do something about these fucking bronzes, man. I keep stubbing my toe on like Laocoon and his sons.
You filling up my spare rooms. I got bronzes out in the backyard. They're just getting rained on every day. I got bronzes. I got bronzes on my sidewalk. My neighbors are complaining.
Yeah, we got to put these fucking bronzes somewhere, and so the Pope says, "Okay, fine. We're gonna put a big fucking public warehouse for them. We're gonna call it the Capitoline Museums, and that's in 1471." And shortly thereafter, they found the Vatican Museums, which is, you know, holds a bunch of marble like this. This is in time for the Renaissance to be happening.
Ross's favorite period.
That's right. And so there is an interest in, like, these guys start going, well, how can we use this for religious purposes? And the answer is, you just get a bunch of your guys to have a look at the, you know, the forms and the methods and try and like imitate them. And so you end up with this like sort of backward-looking interest in old pagan art. We inadvertently create the Civic Museum again after, you know, an experiment in Mesopotamia. And eventually, shit continues in that vein until the Grand Tour is invented and people invent looking at things, which later becomes known as tourism.
All right, excellent. We've created the modern economy through the museum. I fail to see a downside here.
Don't worry, there isn't one. Please don't ask about the Elgin marbles.
I just love that, like, the core conceit of like looking or of art is that you look at the thing, like that's it. Mm-hmm. Like there's like people dress it up really nicely, but all throughout human history, human beings have loved looking at things, and like that's it.
Yeah. Look at this cool little like clay lump I made.
Hey, look! Hey, look at that! Hey, look at that!
Guys, you would not believe the knockers on the statue I found, you guys.
Oh my god, are we getting into Venus of Willendorf discourse now?
Oh my god. Next slide, please. So, meanwhile, as this is bubbling on, we also have the Enlightenment happening, right? And it's sort of precursors. people start to develop things like the scientific method and shit. But this is largely done by sort of like wealthy gentleman scientists who consider themselves to be the intellectual heirs to your Pliny or your fucking Galen or whoever else.
They're just more Wikipedia editors.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm also a little bummed
exactly.
you didn't go with pre-Enlightenment.
But these guys can travel thanks to sailing ships and shit like that. These guys can go all over the world or pay people to go all over the world and bring them back shit that they can keep in their house. This is sometimes called a cabinet of curiosities. And we see a good example here. This is the Cabinet of Curiosities, the museum of a guy called Ole Wurm, but his name looks like Ole Worm.
Ole Worm. This is Ole Worm's garage.
This is Ole Worm's stuff house.
I just really wanted to get Ole Worm in here. Just because that's a good name, man. Now, obviously, since we talked about triumphs, right? Looting stuff off of foreigners to put on display predates these, but it gets a lot more efficient. It gets a lot easier. You can get a broader array of shit. You can get all kinds of like biological specimens. You can get seeds, so you can start planting botanical gardens.
You can buy stuff for cheaper. It doesn't cost a whole talent now. It's just a doubloon.
Yeah. And so some of these guys start letting people in to see their cabinets of curiosities. Some of them start charging for it. Some of them don't. But the history of the modern museum is essentially these weird guys keeping stuff in their rooms being bought out and subsumed by institutional power. And in particular, as the sort of like institutionalization of education rolls on, universities get more powerful and universities start to eat the collections of these guys that are associated with them.
For more on universities, please check out our universities bonus episode.
That's right. This is why a lot of British university museums are named after one guy, like the Hunterian for William Hunter, the Ashmolean, the Pitt Rivers, stuff like that. Is because it started out, the nexus of that collection was one guy and his weird shit. Next slide, please. So this is successful enough, and universities are successful enough that by the 19th century, you start to see once again, purpose-built buildings for this. And also at this time, everyone was jerking themselves off about how Greek and Roman they are, right?
Oh, yeah. Or they're jerking each other's off about how Greek and Roman they are, because that's, what the Greeks and Romans did. Well, I didn't like to talk about that bit, but...
yeah, so everybody's just building each other off,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, buildings that look like temples. And we get this synthesis of guy who keeps stuff in his house, scientific tradition, and religious object of devotion tradition. And they look around for something that's sort of like civic, but also Greco-Roman to call them, and they alight upon museum. And so this is the genesis of the modern museum. This is the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. It's relatively typical. It's built 1841 onwards. Now, the 19th century... I mentioned it's easier to get things. One of the reasons it's easier to get things is because of colonialism. Next slide, please.
Oh, hell yeah.
Heck of a response, Ross.
Here's my sort of like prototypical example. We'll talk about a lot more later of just colonialism in pursuit of stuff to put in museums. This is the Crown of Abud. It's part of a hoard of like Ethiopian gold. In the 1860s, we, the British, defeated the Ethiopians at the Battle of Magdala and literally just booked it with a bunch of their stuff.
Good for you.
Something like 15 camel loads of gold. This is currently at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. We've offered this back as a loan if the Ethiopians renounce any claim of owning it.
Wow, that is heavy-handed.
Now, somehow they did not go for this deal. So it's still there with a bunch of labels that do not explain how we came to get it.
I could explain why aside from like the obvious reason why Ethiopia wouldn't accept it, there's also like a separate thing here, which is that. So the reason the VNA, I'm guessing, would not want to loan the reason you wouldn't want to loan an object to somebody who has a potential property title claim is that they could then keep it and then use potentially, I guess in this case, international courts to try to say that they still own it. So before leaving it from your jurisdiction, you want to make sure that it has no liens or claims. And so that's why they would not want to loan it without losing, without making sure the property title wasn't free and clear.
Yeah, because you make them pinky promise that they're going to give it back, but what if they don't?
Right, because if you say that you don't own it, then they have to give it back.
There was a incident similar to this with one of the A4 class Grizzly Pacifics. Actually, maybe we'll get into that later. I could do some asides about railroad museums and railroad artifacts.
Was that the Dominion of Canada?
I think it was the Dominion of Canada. They wanted the Expo Rail wanted to, or the National Museum of Transport in England wanted to get it on loan, and they really didn't want to give it over because they were afraid they wouldn't get it back.
Next slide, please. So we talked about how excavation and archaeology are linked to the history of the museum, right? This is sort of a broader period of that, right? Because this period of 19th century archaeology is absolutely rapacious, right? You have guys from all European countries dynamiting their way through sites trying to find shiny things.
Yeah, the Parthenon was like pretty well intact for a long time. Until the Victorians got their hands on it.
Oh yeah, you can see on the bottom left here with the stick and the pith helmet. That's Lord Elgin taking the friezes, the marble, off of the fucking top of the Parthenon. Now it's sometimes said that this is done for like safekeeping, and that's basically never true. Like aside from the sort of like idea that nobody was interested in keeping these things preserved where they were. Nobody thought like this. Nobody wrote like this. Nobody said anything about preservation at the time. It was purely this is an interesting thing that will bring me and my country wealth and glory and allow people to like educate themselves and experience a diversity of cultures that we've subjugated, right? And this is wildly popular. This is an absolute craze in Europe and in the United States. And all types of shit get stolen. At some point, there's going to be a content warning, I guess, because we're going to talk about significantly darker shit than this. But
and the Elgin marbles are marble and therefore white, so most of the stuff we would talk about would be darker than that.
Well, no, they used to be painted.
That's a good point. They used to be painted, yes.
Yeah. So museums sort of evolved from this just sort of like staid university hall over time. And I figured what we would do for this next part is talk about some different types of museums. Next slide, please.
So here, yes, Crystal Palace.
Exhibitions. Yes. Great exhibitions.
Where to find.
Look at the like peoples of our empire and their quaint native folkways. Look at our industry and our technology, right? And so this is tremendously influential in a lot of ways. Like, this is where Victorians get shit like chinoiserie, right? Is seeing like textiles and patterns from China or from Japan, and just going like, yeah, I'm going to steal that and like incorporate it into my thing. And so this is like imperialism in full swing. It requires an empire to do this. It requires a shitload of ships and guns, but it also requires an emerging leisure class, right? It requires a bunch of people with top hats to walk around looking at things.
Yes, and you got your you're showing off artifacts from your conquered areas. You're showing off the industry that you're using to enable you to conquer areas more quickly. You're showing off like your your mechanical prowess. The one of the things about the great exhibition here with the Crystal Palace is even the building itself was, just sort of a statement thing. I was like, look at this huge fucking glass and cast iron thing we can build with British engineering. This could never be done anywhere else by anyone because we're the best because we're British.
Yes. and sometimes this is an explicit competition. Like that's what a World's Fair is everybody gets together and builds a pavilion for their country to try and show off and dick measure against everyone else.
I always like that how the 39 World's Fair, they put the they put Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union right across from each other.
Like two-fort.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. Like another example of this, which I like because it's one of those sort of like inflection points for modernity. This is the Great Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, which is also where an anarchist managed to kill the president of the United States.
Yeah. So you guys haven't done that.
Listen. The communists managed to end the Holocaust. So.
Hey, you guys remember that time you killed what was his name? Frick? Was it Henry Frick? Oh no,
Henry Clay Frick. Yeah,
Henry Clay Prick.
Well, that may have also been us. I can never remember which plots are which.
Mm-hmm.
I assume someone will get real mad at me in the comments and then call me stupid for not having an encyclopedic knowledge of every plot that's ever gone down. No, and to that I say thanks for the Patreon money and also blow me.
I believe Henry Clay Frick was killed by an anarchist. Yes.
No, he was attempted to be killed. Alexander Berkman. Yeah. Once again, Emma Goldman's boyfriends do be trying to kill people.
Maybe it's her kink, or was her kink.
Meantime, listen to the Ballad of Shorgosh from the musical Assassins. Anyway, next slide, please. Liam, this one's all you.
Oh no!
Oh no! This is actually me. I was gonna.
Justin, this one's all you.
Okay, so one of these things.
Yeah, I didn't think that was me. It would have been tight though. I'm kind of bummed.
Comes with these exhibitions, right? Like especially the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Is you have the sort of national mythos you're trying to build up. And one show that traveled around to not just exhibitions but around the United States was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, right? Buffalo Bill Cody would, come with his big traveling circus, right? And they'd show off the life on the Western frontier. He had real cowboys, he had real Indians, he had real stuff. They did horse riding, they did rodeo shit, right? And you're doing this as like a method of entertainment, but it's also supposed to be educational. He usually advertised his show as being educational and sort of a traveling exhibition, which is trying to ingrain some kind of national mythos, I guess, into the people of the United States about we're frontiersmen and all this crap, right? And it's very much a lot of propaganda. It's a lot of it is a very late 19th century thing.
And like it had people who had participated in these things, right, including like Native American leaders who would like just like on exhibition. And it's weird how the museum or the exhibition has this ability to like shrink real people into exhibits, right? Even though they're the same people.
There's also like a
zoo.
Human zoo, yeah. What's the
we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
There's also there's a leveling that happens here where what it does is it takes something that happened actually within living memory for all of these people and then turns it into history, right? Literal in that like history is something that people tend to view as a neutral ground. And so this is like a major font of a lot of museum organizing of the past 10 years, which is to say that museums are not neutral. Exhibitions are not neutral. That there was always a political statement that is being made with these kinds of things. Even though at the time, I think Buffalo Bill would have said like, oh, this is an educational thing or whatever. It's like, no, this is making claims here, right? And and it's just like we are not past this as much as like the actual facet of this is unique. We still do exhibitions that are somewhat like this. Maybe not with people who lived through the thing, but certainly with events that have happened in recent memory.
And sometimes with people reenacting the people who lived through the thing.
Right. People from those who descend from those communities, so.
Right. How much of our view of like Civil War history is through Civil War reenactors, who are like old guys in their like 60s, trying to reenact these battles that were fought by teenagers,
Sure, but like even stuff like
through the South is through the lens of lost cause bullshit nonsense. Like, I would say, having grown up north of the Mason-Dixon and 25 miles from Gettysburg, you can go onto the battlefield and see the colossal Virginia statue with Robert E. Lee today, and like, you're gonna form your own narratives, whatever. But like the fact that I think, especially in the United States, the way the Civil War is taught in different places is indicative of the fact that, like, no, all this shit is political.
Yeah, and the living history aspect of it, like you can go to a plantation site and you can get a tour from an educator who is portraying a slave, right? And this is a tremendously weird thing to like have that like taught that way, I guess.
Well, it's making. I think there's like a level here where like marginalized people have to like kind of like portray their own oppression, right? And like and that there's a literal version, which is what you're talking about in the form of like an educator, having to like be an actor. But even just like if you're, say, a person of color and you become a curator of, say, like African American art, right? Like your very existence in the field of museums is one of having to, essentially be the advocate for the thing because people don't value it, right? And so that forces you to then kind of like have to live out racism and oppression just to like have the cultural products of, your community be seen as valuable. And this is why a lot of, African American curators in the United States and museums don't last in their job for more than a year or two.
Well, if you constantly have to basically what feels like beg for a seat at the table to explain your own history,
Speaking of national mythos, though, I have a next slide, which is that you can go full national pride with this stuff, right? And the example that I have here is the Imperial War Museum in London. It's a great museum. They've done a great deal of like useful work within a framework, within a building even, that is very much designed as a store of glory, right? And that's like for a long time the dominant narrative of what a national museum could be was it is a place where we teach this like narrative of victory, of conquest, of glory, of empire, right? And this is not purely a British thing by any means. You can get into this with like museums whose only purpose is sort of civic pride, like
Fort McHenry, for those of you in the United States, is pretty great at this.
I could talk about the National Mall and the Smithsonian because since I work at the Smithsonian. Like,
please do.
Okay, so here's the thing. So in the Smithsonian, we talk a lot about what the guiding mission is, and this is all very public. So I'm not saying anything that's like untoward here, but the goal of the Smithsonian, as it was instantiated, was quote to increase the diffusion of knowledge. There's very serious questions about like whom's knowledge and like what knowledge, but the actual physical site of the Smithsonian, the physical site of the National Mall, is a place of national myth making. I don't think that's news to most of your listeners. But the thing is that what's become kind of odd about that is that the Smithsonian has a lot of museums that aren't just, the Air and Space Museum. The Air and Space Museum, heavily backed by defense contractors. The Natural History Museum does a lot of scientific work that is heavily backed by corporations that benefit from that scientific work. And the American History Museum. Those are kind of like the three big flagship institutions of the Smithsonian. But it also has the Anacostia Community Museum, a community museum built around art made by people in the District of Columbia or around the District of Columbia. it has my museum, the National Museum of African Art, which is about specifically the continent of Africa and its diaspora. And it's weird because the whole thing exists to like sell a particular notion of America that we kind of have been talking about throughout this podcast so far, namely that, imperial power, our culture is so strong, blah, blah, blah. But like in the recent years, I will say that the Smithsonian has done a good job of attempting to kind of like take a more leading role on these things. For example, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which has took a big role in acquiring like objects that were generated during the protests around the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, to put those in museum collections and to say that these things that are happening right now are part of the kind of darker side of our history that people don't often think about. So I just want to I will credit that one good thing, but generally the National Mall, like when you walk on the National Mall and you work especially if you work in the Smithsonian, is like, tourists getting off of buses to go look at dinosaurs, to go look at big planes, to go look at the Batmobile in the center of American History Museum, to walk in when it's 95 degrees down to the Washington Monument and go like, yep, that's a tall pillar. Like, it's like
it's an obelisk, Jeremy.
Oh, sorry. It's an obelisk. Excuse me. But like at the end of the day, like the National Mall is this like really weird space that it also, as somebody who has been lived in DC for 3 years, is a place nobody in DC really goes to. And if you do, that usually says something. Like if you're somebody who runs on the National Mall, that usually means that you like, I don't know. That usually means like you work on the Hill or some shit.
You are a defense contractor or something.
You are a defense contractor, right?
Real people don't go to the National Mall. Sorry.
It's
this weird sort of like
Independence Mall in Philly too.
Antiseptic space. There's a lot of spaces like this. The British Museum is like this even. Yeah. So next slide, please. And here is your warning for where we get into the exceptionally bleak shit. Right. So, a zoo is a kind of museum, since we're talking about kinds of museums, right? And that raises a lot of thorny issues also about conservation and tourism and people, driving through a nature preserve, throwing like sandwiches to bears and stuff. But even stuff like panda diplomacy, right? And like all of these concerns towards things like animal welfare or whatever that are like affected by other things and compromised by other things because we live in a society, right? But this is where we get into the real shit, because anthropology and zoology have not always been sort of separately considered disciplines. Next slide, please.
Oh,
because
right, we did this shit, didn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very long.
Quite a bit.
Very racist history of putting human beings in museums and zoos, and the line between those things being quite blurred. Whether that's whole living people, whole dead people, parts of dead people. What you see here is a fake Congolese village that Leopold II, had built on the royal estate in Tervuren, where he exhibited 267 people behind a fence in order to entertain the public, right, with their folk ways. Now, I will point out that they had to put up a sign asking spectators not to throw bananas or peanuts. So this is sort of the level that we're pitched at in terms of like European.
I mean, they still do that.
Yeah,
to
they
their
still
soccer
do that.
Players.
I've been to soccer matches. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, like, even being dead is not enough to get you out of the clutches of the museum, right? Like, whether that's medical schools or anthropological museums or like ethnographic museums or whatever, there are quite literal skeletons in closets.
The Penn Museum somehow managed to get their hands on the dead kids from the move bombing.
Yeah.
I
had them in a storage closet, basically. Yeah.
And this is okay. So I looked into this heavily because I was so galled as like a collections professional. Like I was just like, I literally am the person who inventories the objects, and stuff like that. I know what's in my database, and I was just like, when they said that they like just didn't know, I like did some digging, and it was very clear that the lead anthropologist there had worked with those remains, had presented those remains multiple times to like graduate students and undergrads, was very aware that these things were in the collection, and they just like didn't do anything about it. It's just like so fucked up that people would think that for an event that was not that long ago that was okay.
It was like it was the 80s. How did the remains even get there? Right?
you kind of get the sense that the change in the museum within like Europe or the US, right, is less it is bad to do this thing. It is bad to like exhibit a human being or a part of a human being, but more are we allowed to talk about this to non-museum people, right?
Yeah, and I will say that like most natural history museums have some amount of like human remains in their collections. They just don't display them anymore. And I will be somewhat charitable and say that it is certainly a fond of most people's plans for the future is to like number one priority, get rid of the human remains, make sure they get buried and go back to the people they need to go back to. I can't speak for every museum, but it's certainly a priority in the Smithsonian.
Now, I mean, my question is, and I think this is a fair question, but I ask it without prejudice to the answer, right? Which is, knowing this, having talked about this, is the museum, right, separable from this legacy? Is a museum always inherently on some level going to be a colonial instrument, or can you sort of like excise this in any meaningful way?
That's a great question, and I generally err on the side of I don't think museums should exist.
Anti-museum action.
Yeah, like I don't like like my job should probably exist, but it probably shouldn't be about museums, right? Like here's the thing: is like museums as a physical structure, as we've demonstrated through these slides, are not. They exist to benefit the state at the core, even if they're privately owned, or if they're privately owned, they also exist to benefit rich people, right? Because that's something we haven't talked about yet. Is like the rise of private museums by billionaires. And they like at the end of the day, museums, they reinforce the status quo, and that even if the people involved in them, and I know many of the people involved in them have good intentions, the core of it is who's in charge of the museums. Well, the directors are all rich people. The boards, they're really rich people. You know, the donors, they're really, really rich people. And those people have a very particular agenda of what they want you to know about history. And that as a museum staffers, we are limited by that stuff because we cannot piss off our donors. And that model itself, the very model itself, is going to lend to things like imperialism, colonialism, racism, all the bad things. Because we are not doing things for the public, and we're not doing things for the community. We're doing them for our donors because that's what allows us to stay open and pay our paychecks.
Let's talk about that with the next slide.
This reminds me of one of the things we maybe should have put in the notes somewhere is something about like the Barnes Foundation and how when they try and have a museum that specifically benefits, in this case, historically black colleges, and then suddenly the board manages to wrest the whole collection away from the rightful beneficiaries and owners. I don't remember.
And then Philly takes it, and you're welcome. You can suck on that, Laura Marion.
So, yeah.
Definitely recommend watching, although go into it with an open mind, The Art of the Steal.
Art of the Steal is a good one, yeah.
It's a good one. It's a little heavy-handed, but...
One of the guys who's interviewed in that a lot, Robert Zoller, he used to write insane articles for the Drexel student newspaper. And then I realized as I grew older from that actually, no, he was completely right in everything he said.
So I have a slide here which is essentially about the difference between, if you like, the soft and hard ways of influencing museums, because we've talked about the soft ways, which are like the expectations that are already there, the people who are in control of them, the people who those people hire, you know, what they're sort of expected to do. But there's also the sort of like blunter instruments, right? The ways of influencing what a museum is, right? And my picture for this is from the US National Holocaust Museum. And you may recognize this poem. It's at the end of the exhibitions by the exit. It's by Martin Niemöller, right? And essentially, the Reagan administration made them change the first two lines of this poem and substitute the word socialist for communist, for fear that it would be too sympathetic to communism, right? This is the least subtle example I can think of explicitly leaning on a museum to essentially do historical revisionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it, as we've said, not just applicable to public museums, private museums, susceptible to anybody's whims, but especially like if there's any public funding involved at all, like when Piss Christ was exhibited at a private gallery, mind you, the National Endowment for the Arts had its budget cut as a consequence of that. And so absolutely everything is on the table when it comes to like censorship versus revisionism. The sort of like editorial control is available provided you have that lever. But like conversely, because museums are almost always desperate for money, right, and influence, if you can offer them either of those things, you can get a lot of things out of them. And this is where we get things like oil companies sponsoring climate change exhibitions, right? Yeah. Because if they can pay for it, then yeah, you can absolutely greenwash your company's reputation by having Shell Presents, Extinction Rebellion or whatever.
So two things here. One is like, for example, Bank of America sponsored a Smithsonian to do a bunch of stuff about a bunch of talks about, race in America and stuff, like that's a good American example, very recent, very public. So I'm not saying anything that people can't go find out. And then I've also been involved in many an exhibition where, for example, we did an exhibition at my last job where it was an exhibition about artwork involving the U.S.-Mexican border. And the artists involved in the exhibition weren't super crystal clear about like, hey, this is like, they were really focused on it being a crime against humanity and didn't really have like any policy prescriptions for it. But like there was a decent amount of us in the museum who wanted something more crystal clear there. And at all points when you're trying to generate content in museums, people are extremely concerned about, well, what is our community going to think? And this was in Arkansas. And people were like, well, we don't want to piss people off too much. And it's like, But we're lying to people, right? At the end of the day. And like, people don't put the same concern on marginalized communities. They don't worry about traumatizing marginalized communities with exhibitions about, colonialism or whatever. Yet those exhibitions, those collections, the very existence of those exhibitions is a form of trauma for those communities, is a form of continued marginalization. And we only seem to care about what white people think about art, like in these Reagan examples with Piss Christ and stuff, right? We only care about what Christian conservatives think. And that means that we need to stop doing X. But when marginalized communities are concerned, it takes a much, much bigger spate of organizing to like get museums to even push it back a little bit.
I think another one is like, please. Even like, it's not just big corporations who influence this, because if you go to a railroad museum south of the Mason-Dixon line, there will always be, and it doesn't matter how big or small the museum is, it could be one of those ones that's like a shed in a little town, there will always be one Jim Crow car preserved, right?
Yep.
Immaculately. And you will walk through and, there'll be one section that was for the whites, there was another section that was for the blacks, and they look just about the same. Because the car is immaculately restored. And in fact, when the car was brand new, those sections look just about the same. But, that doesn't reflect how the car was maintained over its lifetime, right? And then somewhere on the side, there'll be a little plaque that says, this restoration funded by the Daughters of the Confederacy, right? And
I was thinking about that too. I was at the National Constitution Center with my parents a couple weeks ago. And there was an exhibit on the 13th Amendment, and it had been, the way it was portrayed was that the North was sort of a monoculture of abolitionism, which of course is not true. There are race riots in Philadelphia and New York and Boston. Boston rioted about busing in the 70s and 60s. And it was entirely, the South is full of dumb racists and rich dumb racists, and the North is full of, gentle Quakers, and there's no other, no one in the North would ever be racist, certainly not towards, certainly they would not, be pro-slavery. And I mean, it was not in contact with reality, and it was one of those things where you're just like, even like, you can't fucking tell the story without completely telling the story. Like, that's just not true. And that's, I think, the narrative going to school in the North, certainly. Roz, I don't know if you can, I know you went to school in, quote, the South, but
yes,
we were certainly taught that, like, even, again, north of the Mason-Dixon line, also York County, northernmost town to surrender during the Civil War, we gave up without a fight. Fun bit of history there. We were taught blah blah blah, states' rights, blah blah blah, a little bit slavery. But like, when I was a kid in the 5th grade, my class made a Stars and Bars, made one, a patchwork Stars and Bars, and like, we were not taught at any point like that was a problem. It was that they were just different white people from us, and they just had different beliefs, and we just sort of ended up in a war. And I live in fucking Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. If you want another railroad example, go to any German railroad museum. Railroads, the Deutsche Bahn, the sole exception to the process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, absolutely no desire to, like, it's them and fucking corporate websites that are like, the company was founded in like 1923. We developed a new product line in like 1933. Then in 1953, we developed a second new product line. So not good.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please, where I get a little bit more theoretical with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of a little bit of a theory of mine, right? I feel that there's, to any curation, to any museum, there's a sort of a flattening effect, and there's sort of a derealization that goes on, right? It's like how we were talking about like living history, or it's like how we were talking about Buffalo Bill, right? Like, stuff gets shrunk, and stuff doesn't feel real, even if it is, even if you're looking at the actual place where something happened, or you're talking to the actual person who did something. It feels like a museum exhibit. And a museum exhibit is something that is dispassionate, and it's clinical, and it is like emotionally distant from you, right? But also, if you're not very careful with curation, and I don't say this as an insult to museum curators, right? Because a lot of exhibitions are very closely curated, but you can also do this thing where you sort of like cram a bunch of shit into a room, right? And you end up with the ancient Egypt room, which is, it spans thousands of years of history, and like an absolutely huge breadth of human experience. And you go, oh, that's the ancient Egypt room about ancient Egypt. There was a thing called ancient Egypt that happened in ancient Egypt times. And then after ancient Egypt, it was Roman times. And then after that, it was Viking times. And so it leads you sometimes to this sort of like Whig view of history, right? It's the same with art, where you sort art by periods or by like filiation and genealogy. You separate artists into schools or movements that they themselves might not have subscribed to, and you create this interconnectedness that wasn't necessarily there in the first place as a way of understanding it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and like I work at an African art museum, and the fact that there's even like a concept of like, hey, all the Africa stuff goes in the African art museum, right? Like Africa, one of the 7 continents,
Yes.
One of the most populous continents in the world. Nigeria itself, just on its own, is one of the most populous countries in the world, one of the highest GDPs. Like, there are something like a couple hundred ethnic groups in Nigeria itself, right? And yet we have one very small museum in the United States, part of the Smithsonian, dedicated to African art.
This idea of monoculture as oppression, I think, is by, you're right, Alice, by shrinking it down and sort of saying, you all fit into this neat little box. When certainly if you said that basically to a white European, you would get either the "No, I'm 100% Italian, baby," or whatever fucking insane thing, and they'd be very proud of that. But conversely, like, no, it just all goes into the neat little Africa box. And
it doesn't even just go into the neat little Africa box. It's a step further where what the takeaways are very simple, right? Which is to say, like for the ancient Egypt example, it's like, as Alice was saying, ancient Egypt moves into the Greeks, moves into the Romans, right? The only role that it's allowed in history is to be a segue, as opposed to something that is valuable on its own, could stand on its own, and was, in the case of ancient Egypt, lasted for hundreds of years.
and to say nothing of the Nubians.
Yeah. But also contained people whose names we know, right? And like, in particular, there's this thing about putting shit under glass, right? Presenting it for exhibition that can really sort of like suck all of the humanity out of something. And it leads you to consider it in sort of this dispassionate historical way.
Right.
Instead of like thinking about people from the past as people.
Well, and something we haven't talked about is that one of the changes of museums that happened, post the kind of 1800s formation of museums is that the way that we kind of got around this whole imperialism thing was to be like, okay, well, we're also preserving things, right? We're keeping culture, quote unquote, whatever that is, safe for future generations, right? And that preservation, though, has a way of kind of, making everything appear neutral and like putting things under glass, like Alex was saying. And it's like,
what a beautiful segue to my next slide.
Wow,
by the way,
I keep
thank you for
not
that.
knowing what we're doing next, and then I just do it.
Don't worry, Jeremy,
Thank you so much for not clicking ahead.
And I don't know what I'm doing next, but
You could see where I was clicking. I was not clicking ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit about how you can't win with these decisions about preservation and restoration, right? Because, like, again, it's the question of like separability from like a viewpoint or a legacy, right? Like, my example here is painted statuary. We've sort of more recently come to understand that a lot of antique statuary was pretty luridly painted. We've seen reconstructions of that painting, but also we know that having left it unpainted in a state of decay, right, created a huge swath of like art and culture based on imitating this sort of like ruined art.
Thank you, John Ruskin.
That's right. Yeah. And so you sort of can't win, I feel. Like this idea of like the museum's role is to preserve, that's something that has been invented after the fact, right? A lot of the stuff that it's being applied to was not collected for the purpose of preserving it. But now that it is a thing that people are willing to talk about, you get into some serious questions of, should we present this painting the way visitors here have seen it for 200 years and everyone expects to see it, or the way that it was the way that it looked the day after it had been painted? To what extent do we have to like try and halt aging and keep stuff in stasis? And is there a like historical role for an aged thing?
Well, and there's like in terms of the field of conservation, the field concerned with this kind of stuff, like the general best practice, for example, for paintings is that, so with paintings, we can match pretty much most colors pretty easily. And that so when you restore a paint, or I actually hate the word restore. When you repair a painting and put new color on it, what you do is you do it like one shade off of what the original color was, because you don't want to make it obvious. You don't want to make it super. You don't want to make it seem fake that it's like, oh, this is actually what the historical object that was given to us looked like. Or like, and when we got it, specifically like when we got it, you want it to look a little bit off. And that is a deliberate move generally by most conservators. But, you raise good questions. I was like, why is that the case? Like, why do we fetishize kind of like the notion that this thing is really old and it still looks this good, as opposed to a kind of like a Ship of Theseus situation where, the Mona Lisa at this point is basically just a a new painting, right? It's been touched up so many times. Who's to say where the original painting begins and the various conservator touch-ups have stopped?
Well, it also sort of applies even to like modern art, right? In that it's not necessarily, let's say displayed in the most authentic manner, right? I'm thinking in particular here about Mark Rothko, right? Because you see a Rothko painting, it's usually in a nice, well lit gallery, and these paintings were intended to be viewed in very low light. That was one of the one of his original intentions. You get more intensity of the experience of color and all this stuff, right? But that's never how they're displayed. It's always you're in this gallery and you sort of it's okay. This is red in a different shade of red. All right, whatever. I'm moving on to the next one.
Yeah, this like really gets into sort of one of the things that really interests me, which is like you can't jump into the same river twice, right? You can't experience the same artifact from the same standpoint as the people in history as it was designed for. Even for the person who walked through the same gallery 5 minutes before is going to be viewing a different thing differently, right? However much you try to curate that experience. And like, you can be really, really annoying about this. You can really fuck with curators on this because you can say, oh, you claim to be preserving this Velasquez, but you're not showing it under candlelight. Interesting.
Oh, yeah. 100%. Like with, in the case of like a Rothko example, or in the case of like even Impressionism, actually Impressionism is probably a better example. Impressionism now is viewed as this kind of like quaint thing where a knockoff is in your mom's bathroom. But at the time, it was a deeply radical thing. And people don't view Impressionism as a radical thing anymore. So like any kind of lens by which anybody's looking at Impressionism is not intended at all, right? That we just like, oh, look at the pretty flowers or whatever. At the time, Impressionism pissed people off.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So my next slide, this one's all you, Jeremy, because I don't know shit about labor. Right?
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about labor. Okay.
All I know about labor is that museums take a lot of hard work to make them stay up, and they don't respect it.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll talk about is like who works in museums traditionally. Like, so traditionally in museums, so to get into a museum, you have to have both an undergraduate and a master's degree. So already you're looking at people who are capable of affording both of those things. Second, there's usually some amount of unpaid internship time that needs to happen. Depending on which part of museum, whether it's like collections or curating, which is at the more extreme end, you might need 2 to 3 years of unpaid internships to even get an interview. And that's still not a guarantee. Obviously, this is a bad thing, and people are trying to change it. The really interesting thing is that a lot of museums talk a big game about the importance of, being part of their communities, being good to their workers and stuff. But then the minute there's a whiff of unionization, we hired an anti-union firm. This is going to break up the family. All the classic stuff comes out, and a lot.
It's coming between a union will only get in between you and your Etruscan ball vessel,
right? And that's the exact point is that museums almost always will side with objects and care more about objects than they care about people. And it's a really good question for all of you to ask yourselves: is like, why is it in society that we privilege old objects but made by dead people over currently living human beings? And that is something that I've been asking myself the longer and longer I've been in this field, where what if the museum is less about objects and it's more about experiences? It's about community. It's about, education and actually living out those things that it says, rather than like just fetishizing old stuff of often dubious importance.
Oh yeah, there's a colossal amount of fakes and like bodged together reconstructions from the past, right? Like,
or like even take Rothko. I fucking love Mark Rothko. I started in this field as a security guard, standing for 8 to 9 hours a day with very minimal breaks, having to go on a radio to 40 people to ask to use the fucking bathroom, right? Like that's how I started in this field, and I spent a lot of time looking at Mark Rothko, and I spent more time with Rothko than most people have. But here's the thing. I would gladly trade all of those Rothkos if it meant that everybody I know in museums could have a good living wage, right? And it turns out that Rothko is really expensive, and that if people sold those, that we could maybe give people a good living wage. But that's like
I could see myself at the end of that shift trading Rothko's entire cannon for a chair.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, or just even a cushioned mat to stand on, which we did get for a while, which was really nice. I will say, when you've been standing all day, the difference between standing on a hardwood floor versus a nice cushioned mat feels like a feather bed. But as far as the contemporary unionization drive goes, like museums, a lot of museums are in the process of attempting to unionize or have unionized. The problem has been that, museums specifically private museums, have shown their willingness to just kind of fire everybody. This happened about a few years ago with the...
You're telling me that the Getty family don't like it when they work as unionized? That's crazy.
Right, exactly. The Marciano Foundation, the minute all their guest services staff voted to union or announced they were unionizing, they just fired everybody and closed the entire art foundation. Like, just closed the whole thing down because it was a vanity project for the Marciano brothers. I think it's really revealing that museums talk this big game about being so important to communities, but yet, even insofar as they're even remotely important to communities, which I actually reject that most museums are important. Most people don't go to museums. This is like a thing that we don't talk enough about. Like 99% of people in the world will not go to your museum. Full stop. Full stop. So who's that 1%? Who's going?
How many museums have you visited multiple times? For me, it's like the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania and not much else. And that's only because they have a annual Rails and Ales where you can go drink beer with
that sounds like a Wix, though.
Oh, it's fucking great.
It's great.
If it happens next year, that's maybe we should all go there.
Yeah. Can we also talk about worker safety in museums?
Oh, yeah. So I have also been an art handler and I'm friends with many art handlers. And so a major problem in the art handling field is that most art handler positions are contract positions. Specifically, most of them are in New York City, LA, the big art cities. And those contractors have very little protections under U.S. employment law. And so with the rise of contemporary sculpture being so big and monolithic, think of your Jeff Koons sculptures, think of your big like metallic public art pieces of crap, like that stuff requires things like cranes, special training, to even get close to it, you're wearing a hard hat. And that because they're contractors, when they do inevitably get injured, because here's the thing about art that's a little bit different from working in, like, say, industry, or at least my understanding of it. And, Justin, please correct me if I'm wrong. But like in art, we're not really allowed to drop something, right? Like, I will do everything in my physical power to not drop a $40 million painting. And in fact, have been in the position where, like, I was lifting a giant Audubon elephant folio, which is like just like a truly massive book. It's like the thing is like 4 feet long. And my friend and I were taking it down because I needed to inventory it. And we took it down and we were holding it and my arms were shaking. I'm like, Michael, I cannot hold this thing. And I'm like, well, you need to hold it or we're going to drop it about 10 feet down onto the floor because we're like high up on ladders when we're doing this. And it's like, I just like kind of like willed through it. And then like my arms were hurting for like weeks after. And that's like a really minor example, but I've had friends who've blown out backs. We've had contractors that we've used who are moving crates where full several 100-pound pedestals have fallen on them. And then like, dudes just walk off the job because they don't have health insurance. They don't want to put a claim in. They don't want to get fired from their job because they put a claim in. And so, a lot of art handlers have started to unionize or have tried to get some kind of employment protections in because it is a very brutal field because what we're asking you to do is often has to be done with your hands without machinery. And you have to follow whatever bullshit rules an artist comes up with to handle an object.
Yeah, Jeff Koons' new thing is a big fucking spear with a worker on the end of it.
I imagine just a really big painting is also like a huge hassle.
Oh yeah, I've moved Jackson Pollock paintings that were probably 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, and like that's something you do with like 10 people because you have to do it by hand and you have to lift it onto a wall. You got to hang it, and if you drop it. Like that painting was insured for $36 million. there's no equivalent in our society for something that's so discreet yet so valuable.
Mm.
And it's nerve wracking.
So-
Handling art is very nerve wracking.
Well, would imagine.
Is there hope for unionization though? Is there a positive note to end this slide on?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, you know, a lot of museums, you know, there's a good amount of museums that unionized in like the 90s, and then there was kind of like a big death knell of that. And that recently there's been a huge spate of it. And also, even if museums are not actively unionizing, I can guarantee you that pretty much every museum has had conversations about it. I can guarantee you that people have organized within their museums without doing a union. For example, opposing new projects that would take advantage of people or require things like, you know, the equivalent of crunch. You know, a whole other thing is working on exhibitions. So like 2 to 3 weeks before an exhibition, you're usually looking at working like 80-hour weeks, depending on how big the exhibition is. People have organized against that. So they might not be forming unions, but they are putting pushback on directors. They're doing things like going to the press about abusive bosses, and they're getting those people fired, and racist bosses and stuff like that. So I actually I feel very encouraged every day at my comrades and colleagues for trying to make the museums a better place to work. We just need the people in power to get the fuck out of the way so that we can actually make museums what they should be and what I think the public, at least in the US, deserves, right? You know, I can only speak to the US because I work for a public institution, but like you're the taxpayers of things like the Smithsonian. Like, you know, we exist for you. And, you know, if we're only just serving rich people or we're only just serving corporations, then we're not living out that original mission statement of to increase the diffusion of knowledge. It's to increase the diffusion knowledge for who, right? And it should be for you. And so that's what I just want to like let people know that in museums, the actual workers, we want to make it a better experience for you. And it's all the people in power, the corporations that get in the fucking way of that. And it's very frustrating, but also there's a clear villain. And the great thing about clear villains is they're easy to organize against.
Speaking of clear villains, I have one more problem with the museum, right? Next slide, please. And that is, once you have the word museum out there, just anybody can call their shit a museum, right? And it gets a bit of the sort of like imprimatur, gets a bit of like academic clout from calling itself a museum. It's not a particularly protected term anywhere, as far as I know. Like you can put a museum up saying whatever the fuck you want, such as young Earth creationism. But you can also like use a legitimate museum to sort of like launder the reputation of a dubious actor, whether that's a nation, whether that's a company. And for instance, there's a giant franchise Louvre in Abu Dhabi, which is like hilarious to me. It's great. There's a massive modernist building there, which is like designed to make you go, "Oh, look at the pretty art," not ask any questions about the slave labor. Which
you can do like a big statement museum, like in Bilbao. Your big deconstructivist building, you just build it, and then it's like, well, everyone's going to come from all over to see this thing. Or you can do something like, and now everyone's copycatting that. Like, there's even like a big deconstructivist art museum in Roanoke, fucking Virginia now.
Oh, sure is.
Yeah, it's finally going to put Roanoke on the map.
It
was already on the map.
And then one of the weird ones is I think you can have like a museum that's trying to push some like naked ideology, but which does have some actually interesting artifacts. I'm thinking like the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I understand is actually
they don't have them anymore.
Yeah, because the FBI.
Well, they made them give it back, right? But also like the Spy Museum. Like
which is genuinely interesting.
The Newseum was a big one.
Oh God, yeah.
And then
the CIA has the axe that killed the ice pick that killed Trotsky.
Yeah, police museums are fascinating, and they usually run by police departments.
Oh, we're gonna get canceled again because you want to be a cop.
I want to get into Scotland Yard's museum.
Jeremy was a security guard at a museum, so that's also kind of a cop.
Basically, a kind of cop.
I'm just me walking up to you, getting paid $12 an hour to go. Like, please don't touch that. There's two things I want to say here. One is that with weird museums, I encourage everybody to Google Branson, Missouri. If you don't know about Branson, Missouri,
hell yeah,
Hell yes.
there's a lot of weird museums in Branson, Missouri. I'm just doing some light Googling here, and we have the Titanic Museum attraction, which is just a rich guy who bought up a bunch of Titanic relics, and now they're in Branson, Missouri. We've got the world's largest toy museum, which I believe it means the largest version of the toys, not that it's the largest toy museum.
Yes.
The Celebrity Car Museum, that sounds great. And other things like that. So that's like the kind of like funny end. And then the other end is that the Tax Shelter Museum, which is to say rich people founding museums because they want to show off their art collection. And that, hey, added bonus, don't have to pay taxes because the art is owned by the museum, not by me. And actually, the requirements under U.S. law to be like a tax-free entity as a museum are not super rigorous. You know, they're somewhat rigorous, but they're not that rigorous. There's been a lot of serious questions about, like, for example, museums founded by rich people where you need to make a reservation, right? So, like, one of the things is like the museum has to be open to the public. Well, what is open to the public?
Right.
And so, like, a lot of museums you can just walk into and you might have to pay a ticket or you can get in for free. Whereas a lot of these rich people museums, you have to like make a reservation, and like their actual, like, the facility might be like gigantic, but they do like 2,000 visitors a year. And so it's like basically just like a place to store their art tax free. And I will tell you, the taxes on art can be very expensive. And it's something that a lot of rich people are really concerned about, not paying taxes on their art. Could do a whole other thing about free ports.
Hell yes.
You
Next slide, please.
You got another kind of museum, which is the Reputation Laundering Museum, by which I mean the Henry Ford.
Or the the Crystal River Museum, the one in Arkansas, Jeremy's favorite.
Oh, Crystal Bridges.
Crystal Bridges.
Yeah, I worked there. Crystal Bridge is pretty good. I mean, you know, it was founded by the Waltons, but the actual, like, in the community, it's pretty decent. People go there like 4 times a year in Arkansas, and like that's actually probably better than most museums. But yeah, it is very much exists at the reason of one person, which is a really serious question to ask. Like, why does it exist? Because one person wanted it to exist.
So I wanted to talk a little bit. I wanted to disappear entirely up my own arse here, right?
Yeah.
And talk about sort of theoretical alternatives for radical museum praxis, right? So
a Rothko in every home.
Well, like the reason I was thinking about this was because anytime a Confederate statue gets taken down finally, it's always said of it that it's being sent to a museum, right? It's being warehoused somewhere. Being
sent to a museum upstate where it can live out its life happy in the field.
Yeah, it's being sent to a museum for its crimes. But like,
I can tell you what, we don't want them. I'll tell you that.
I know, but you're getting them anyway, because that's like the sop to people who want to see them stay up, is they're going to be on public display and they're going to be studied and stuff.
Didn't they just sent Nathan Bedford Forrest and his statue to the National Museum of the Confederacy?
Which nation? The winning one. Yeah, so there's so I want to suggest that there are different currents in reimagining the museum. One of which is to improve the existing museum from the inside, right? To unionize museum workers, to like attempt to exercise some kind of like bottom up control of content, right? But there's also different kinds of museums. You can have a museum that is intended to present things like social history, like say we have like a model tenement flat on display in Glasgow. We have a People's Palace, which is full of social history exhibits. Or you can have museums that are explicitly from marginalized perspectives. Jeremy, you mentioned the National Museum of African American History and Culture earlier. I think that's tremendously important.
Oh yeah, and extremely popular, and probably one of the best museums in the country, honestly. It's backed by that community. It is intensely important to it. People talk about how transformative it is. It's really, really concerned about addressing the needs of like regular people. It's good.
They have the only properly presented Jim Crow car in the country.
Yeah. But meanwhile, while you guys are fucking around with like actual material improvements, I am out here reading the work of surrealist Andre Breton. And the picture for this slide is a collage, an art installation he made called The Wall, right? About which he said, isn't the real significance of a work not the meaning we think we give it, but the meaning it is likely to take in relation to what surrounds it. And Breton was very interested in the wall as a sort of a magnetic surface, as a sort of contextualizing surface, right? And one of the things that he posited was a musée imaginaire, a museum without walls, something that like fulfills the function of a museum without needing to be in a building with columns out the front of it, which is displaying a load of shit, right? And that's partly what this collage is about. It's like, it is a collection of stuff that invites you to try and like make connections between it and make sense of it and contextualize it. And it's sort of deliberately designed to frustrate you in that. It's a lot like that that AI generated name one thing in this picture image, right? So that's my sort of like open question is there a meaningful hope for a sort of like deconstructed museum?
I would ask what if museums didn't have objects, right? Like what if, you know, I always think I'm actually doing a presentation on this like in a few weeks about museums in 3021. It's like, what would a museum in 1,000 years in the future be about? And like, to me, I think that the museum should not be something that just exists in a few different places, but in fact exists everywhere and shows the creative and cultural talents of the people in every community. But is not wedded to objects and instead wedded to connections between people and wedded to experiences. This is why like I don't like hate most of the Instagram museums, because like people obviously have fun at those things. Like what if all of art was just like less serious than it is? It's something I think about a lot, because like all of this stuff just is like museums is like very serious, and it's like, what if it was just posting? Like, you know, like you know, that was my final question right on the slide is the internet a museum? Right, exactly. Like you know, I see art every day on Twitter, and it's not that the art is like people posting the art. The art is just like the kind of like riffing. Like when Twitter is at its best, it's like the art that's like where people are just riffing off of each other. They're operating in shared languages, you know, and all that kind of shit is like actually kind of pretty solid. Whereas like going to look at things and having to have somebody tell you what it means is like really not great. And I think that like the internet is absolutely a museum. Video games are a museum. Walking around in nature is a museum. Going to the grocery store is like a grocery store is a museum. Like, you know, we present objects in the world and we take them in a lot of different ways.
So we have one final slide, which is about the most urgent sort of cause of decolonizing the museum and radicalizing the museum, right? Which is what I can broadly summarize as all the shit we stole.
Yeah, so these are two of the Benin bronzes, which were taken during what is called, and I say this in scare quotes, of the Benin Punitive Expedition, which was done by the British, who
hi, Albert.
Who sounds like something out of Soldier of Fortune magazine.
I know, right?
Yeah.
They razed Benin City basically to the ground, and a bunch of dudes like stole all the stuff that wasn't nailed down. And they did this because like a couple of British soldiers were killed. And the Benin bronzes were actually parts of the royal court of Benin, which is a centuries old monarchy that continues to exist today. The king is called the Oba. There is still an Oba of Benin. There's been many Obas of Benin, and they would like the objects back. This is like quite a clear ask from the Nigerian government and from the people of Nigeria. Most of them are in Britain, but a number of them are also in Germany, I believe France, and there's a few in the US as well. And Professor Dan Hicks wrote a really great book called The British Museum about these bronzes and the history of them and what the asks are to give them back, I highly recommend that book. It's very good. And museums, I wanted to just talk about like why museums don't want to give stuff back. And you might be like, okay, well, museums just don't want to give stuff back because, we own it now and we won. It's like, nah, that used to be the case. Now it's like museums have come up with all these fancy reasons as to why. So, for example, they'll be like, first off, there's like the kind of like imperialist patronizing thing, which is like, oh, Africans in Nigeria could not take care of these bronzes very well. They don't have climate control. They don't have, good safe storage or whatever, which is just like pure racism. And then there's the other level of like, well, we could share them and that would be great for both sides. And it's like, yeah, but if they're asking for them back, it's their property. And that's the core thing to me, right? If we're going to believe that property exists, then like they have the better claim to the property because it was their property. And they should be allowed to know what to do with it. The disposition, this is my personal opinion now, is the disposition of it doesn't really matter to me. Even if there was serious questions of whether Nigeria could care for them well, which there isn't, it can care for them perfectly fine. Even if there was serious questions about that, that's not our problem because we stole them. If you stole, say my laptop, and then I went to you and I'm like, hey, can I have my laptop back? And you said, well, you weren't going to take good care of it. That still doesn't mean you get to keep my laptop. You stole my fucking laptop. It's up to me to decide what the fuck I do with it.
Remember slide 2 when I said that the invention of law was a big mistake?
Right, exactly.
This is particularly relevant for Britain because our greatest weapon in the fight against ever having to give back any of the shit we stole is a legal contrivance in the form of the British Museum Act 1963, right? Which explicitly forbids the British Museum specifically from ever disposing of any artifact in its collections unless it is of no academic use to anyone that like could visit the museum. It's deliberately extremely restrictive.
Wait, the British Museum can't deaccession things?
Like a gigantic Indiana Jones style warehouse full of crap. They have to build a new one every day because of all the shit they have in their collection that they just want to get rid of and can't. And they can't display it. I mean, there is definitely something to be said about a lot of museums have a lot of stuff that's just crap that they just want to get rid of.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I guess the British Museum here is having to build a detailed inventoried landfill.
Genuinely, there are there are precisely 4 circumstances in which the British Museum can dispose of an object. And that's if it's a duplicate, if it was made after 1850 and is primarily made of printed matter, if it's unfit to be retained and can be disposed of without detriment to the interests of students, or if it's become useless to the purposes of the museum by reason of damage, physical deterioration, or infestation. And if it's not in one of those, well, however strong the moral claim is, the British Museum is forbidden under statute from giving it back. And this has been ruled to extend to even shit like looted old masters from Nazi Germany, where people will go, hey, that's my grandmother's Rembrandt or whatever. And like, here is a photograph of me as a child with this same Rembrandt.
Right.
The High Court will fully just be like, yeah, that's very interesting. Still can't give it back. Because that's what the statute is. It's up to Parliament to change it, and Parliament has no inclination to. So
tough shit, I guess. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm reminded of. I'm going to bring it back to railroad museums again. I'm reminded of.
Hell yeah.
I'm reminded of Steamtown in Scranton, Pennsylvania. If you go to Steamtown, there's this walkway that goes from the mall at Steamtown, where they demolished half the downtown to build a mall that was going to revitalize the town. It didn't work. And you go over this rail yard full of just, this collection of rust, just these old passenger cars, which have had no care in like 60 years at this point, because there's just parts of the collection at Steamtown that they've decided we'll get to that eventually. And eventually was 60 years later. And some of it's very interesting and valuable equipment. And some of it's just, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western multiple unit passenger cars, of which there's about 1 billion hanging around. And it's all just sitting there rusting. And because they can't curate their collection, they hold on to everything. It's just going to keep rusting. And this is, part of, it's not just like, if they had fewer artifacts, they still might not be able to care for the interesting stuff. But, the collection is bigger than can be effectively preserved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to drag people down too much, because there have been some notable successes in returning stolen and looted artifacts, right? It's just that it's like the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot more shit that is staying where it is. And the biggest sort of concession anybody's willing to make is to express regret, maybe. And that's literally what I had. That's a museum.
Yeah, that's
That's the problem with museums. There's so much shit wrong with museums.
And we got out of here by 7.
I was about to say.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing just to put at the end of the podcast, just to cover do a little bit of CYA here?
Yes.
So just to cover my ass, the views that I've said do not represent the views of the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of African Art, or any other entity that I may or may not work for.
And if people want to find more of those views, where can they read
if you
them?
want to find more of those views that are not the views of my institution, you can find them on Twitter at Porch Rates, PORCHRATES. I used to run a blog where I rated and reviewed porches. That was my original claim to fame. And then I deleted it because I'm an idiot. And now I just talk about museums.
What if the museum has a porch, or is that a portico?
Actually, all museums are porches. All museums are porches.
All right.
A map.
Yes. All right. Well, I think that was the episode then.
Wow, we did it.
We did it.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone. We're about to record a second episode now, but without Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, because I'm going to go make some stir fry. So.
All right.
Fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Jeremy. This was a really good episode.
Yeah, no problem. It was nice to meet Alice, and nice to talk to you again, Justin and Liam. Hopefully you guys can come down here. Well, not Alice, but hopefully you.
Sometime.
Oh, that's Islamophobia.
Well, no, just because
there.
Alice is in the UK, isn't she?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
She is.
So, well, Justin and Liam, if you guys want to come down to DC, Alice, if you can come across the pond, that could happen too.
We're trying to arrange something.
We're working on it.
Yes.
Yeah, we Julia and I live in a
podcast discussions.
There is a dive bar next door to our apartment. I'll just tell you y'all that right now. So, anyways, all right, I'll talk to y'all later.
All right, thanks for coming on, Jeremy.